Okay, today we're going to read Happy Birthday, Mr. Kang. And this is written and illustrated by Susan L. Roth. So that means that she both created the story, but also drew the pictures and the art that is included in this story. Our genre is realistic fiction. So that's where it has characters and events that are like people and events that could happen in real life. However, she did create these characters and story in her mind. So that's what makes it fiction. And it's going to ask you, how are the characters in this story like anyone you know? Don't forget to connect this to our question of the week, which is, what does it mean to grant freedom? 43 years before his grandson Sam was born in the New World, Mr. Kang left China and came to America. Every day he chopped scallions, wrapped dumplings, and pulled noodle dough into long and perfect strands for the hungry people who ate at the Golden Dragon restaurant in New York City. When Mr. Kang turned 70, Mrs. Kang had a birthday party for him. "Make a wish," said Sam as Mr. Kang shut his eyes, puffed his cheeks, and blew out all the candles on his cake. Everyone clapped and shouted, "Hooray!" "What was your wish?" Sam asked. "3 wishes," said Mr. Kang. "I want to read the New York Times every day. I want to paint poems every day. And I want a bird, a huai of my own. I'll feed him every day, and on Sundays I'll take him to the Sarah Delano Roosevelt Park on Delancey Street. Enough cooking." "Good idea," said Mrs. Kang. "I'll cook for you, and the Golden Dragon restaurant can get a new cook." "Grandpa, why do you want a bird in a cage? There are birds all over the place outside," said Sam. "Sam," said Mr. Kang, "this is not just an American bird in a cage. This is a Chinese bird. My grandfather had a huai in a cage. Now I want a huai in a cage. And sometimes you and I will take him to Sarah Delano Roosevelt Park on Delancey Street together. And so it is that every morning he reads it while he drinks his tea and eats his sweet and fragrant almond cakes warm from the oven." Mr. Kang sits at the kitchen table and thinks about the sun showing through the trees in the park or the moon peeking into his window. He listens to words in his head, then he picks up his brush and paints a poem. Sometimes he paints a poem twice to practice his brushwork. Mrs. Kang hangs the poems on the kitchen cabinets, and then, after making sure that the door and the windows are shut, Mr. Kang opens his huai cage. Speaking softly, he invites the bird to stand on the table. Mr. Kang cleans the cage with a damp towel and dries it with a soft cloth. He takes out the hand-painted ceramic water bowl, rinses it, and puts it back in its stand full of cool, clear water. He washes the hand-painted ceramic food bowl and puts it back, full of his own special recipe of millet coated with egg yolks and mixed with chopped meat. These days, this is the only cooking Mr. Kang does. Last, Mr. Kang takes a small piece of silk cloth, dampens it with water, not too hot, not too cold, and gently wipes the sleek gray feathers of his bird. The huai walks right back into his cage. He prefers to give himself a bath. "Never mind, birdie," says Mr. Kang. "Instead of the bath, I'll read you my poem. I know you can understand. We both left our homeland. We will speak the language." Rushing the golden dragon against a chilly wind, the icy tears on my cheeks melt with memories of warm old days. Those who never left their homes stay safe, wrapped in the arms of their mother-father land. When they look out their narrow windows, they will see their own kitchen gardens. They know every plum tree, every kumquat, every blade of grass, each gray pebble. We, who long ago tossed on cold waters, looking only straight ahead, watch our city mountains from wide windows, tall rooftops, yet our old hearts hold old places. We save in old, grown heads a full-blown rose in summer, the sound of bamboo leaves when the wind is gentle, the taste of mooncakes. The Huami sings his own melody back to Mr. Kang. Mr. Kang closes his eyes to listen. Beautiful birdie, you are a good poet and a good friend to me, says Mr. Kang. Sam usually comes to visit on Saturdays. If Mr. Kang is cleaning the cage, then the Huami sings to Sam. Sam holds out his finger, and the Huami holds on tightly. They stare at each other, and each without blinking. Did he really fly from China? Sam asks one time. In an airplane, says Mr. Kang. China is so far, even for a bird. You should let him go. Maybe he wants to fly home. I don't think he could without an airplane. Anyway, he likes me. Home is here with you. If he went home now, I think he would miss his Sundays on Delancey Street. Mr. Kang put his arm around Sam's shoulder and hugs him. I have a very smart grandson, he sighs. Maybe one day we can visit China together. And this is how Mr. Kang spends his days, except for Sundays. On Sundays, Mr. Kang gets up when it's dark. He washes his face, puts on his clothes. When he is ready, he picks up the cage by the ring on top. The freshly ironed cover is tied shut, and the bird is still sleeping. As he opens the door to leave the apartment, Mr. Kang is padding quickly behind him. Wait for me, she calls. Shh, says Mr. Kang, but he waits as she closes the door and turns her key. Mr. Kang and his bird lead the way. He walks gingerly, holding on to the banister to steady himself as he goes down the stairs. Out the door, down the block, across the street he glides to Sarah Delano Roosevelt Park on Delancey Street. Mrs. Kang follows, 3 steps behind. She sees her friends and slips away to join them. Mr. Kang hangs the cage on the fence, stretches his arms, and breathes in the morning. Mr. Lum arrives with a cage in each hand. How are you, my friend? How's the bird? We are enjoying the morning, smiles Mr. Kang. Mr. Lum, when I see your cages resting on the green ivy floor of Sarah Delano Roosevelt Park in New York, I remember my arm is lifted up to hold grandfather's big hand, and that ivy is green from the Shanghai sun, and the ginkgo tree is blowing in the soft Shanghai breeze, and that heat in my breast is from my sweet and fragrant almond cake. Grandmother slipped it into my pocket, and it is still there, warm from her oven. So we can see the parts that are within these tan lines. Those are the poems that Mr. Kang has written, and they put them into the story where they fit. So he wrote a poem about how his time with his friend Mr. Lum reminds him of his time in China and his childhood there. Even when you speak a greeting to your friend, you are painting a poem, says Mr. Lum. Mr. Kang bows his head. Today is a special Sunday morning because Sam and Mr. Kang are going to the park together. Sam slept at his grandparents' house last night. It is still dark, and he is rubbing his eyes as he jumps from his bed. Just like Grandpa, he washes his face and puts on his clothes. Together, at dawn's first light, they lift the cage. The cover is still tied, and the bird is still sleeping. Sam opens the front door. Grandpa steps out, and Grandma is there waiting behind them, just as she is every Sunday morning. Wait for me, she says. Shh, says Mr. Kang and Sam, but they wait as she closes the door. Mrs. Kang takes 1 extra minute to slip 2 warm almond cakes into Sam's pocket. Then Sam and Mr. Kang lead the way down the stairs, out the front door, and on to the corner, across the street, all the way to Sarah Delano Roosevelt Park on Delancey Street. As usual, Mrs. Kang follows until she sees her friends. Sam sets a bird cage gently on the ground. Mr. Lum's cages are already hanging. "Look who's here," says Mr. Lum. "How are you, Sam? You're getting so big. How old are you?" "7," says Sam. "Only 7?" says Mr. Lum. "You're handling that cage better than a 12-year-old would." Sam smiles. An old grandfather does not mind growing old in a foreign land with such a grandson, says Mr. King. "I am happy in this strange land. I see my grandson planted in the new, rich earth, growing straight and smart and tall. I water him. The sun shines on his firm young leaves as I watch for his flowers and for his fruit." And so here we can see that there is a metaphor. So he is comparing his grandson to what? To a plant. Okay, he's saying that he is planted in the new rich earth, which would be the new country, that he's growing. He waters him. Now, he doesn't actually put water on him, right? He is watering him with love, with support, with information and knowledge and culture. And then the sun shines on his firm young leaves, and he watches for his flower and his fruit. So he's watching as he learns and grows, is the metaphor that he's making there. "More poems, Mr. Kang," says Mr. Lum. "I think you always speak in poems." "Your ears are kind to my words, my friend," says Mr. Kang. 2 more men with 2 more cages arrive, then another, and yet another. Soon there are 27 cages in the park. Mr. Kang lets Sam untie the cover. A strand of light passes through the bamboo bars. As the sun climbs, the men and Sam open all the curtains, inch by inch. "They sing sad songs," said Sam. "They sing of their strong young years," says Mr. Lum. "They sing about their grandfathers," says Mr. Wu. "Maybe they sing about their grandsons," says Sam. "They sing about being in their cages," said Mr. Wu. "Probably they want to fly out." "Like me in my cage," says Mr. Kang. "Like me making noodles every day for 50 years. "I would fly out if I were a bird," says Sam. Mr. Kang stands away from the fence. "Maybe my smart grandson is right. Maybe this bird should be free." Mr. Kang walks slowly toward his cage. "Stop!" Mr. Lum puts a hand on his friend's arm. "Mr. Kang, do not be foolish." The men form a circle around Mr. Kang, and everyone is talking at once. The women rush over. "Mr. Kang," says Mrs. Kang, "did you forget about your 3 birthday wishes already? What will you do when you finish painting your poems and there is no bird to sing to you afterwards?" "Ever since my birthday, I am a free man," says Mr. Kang. "Maybe this Hua Mei wants to be a free bird." "America is the land of the free," Sam says. "Sam is a 7-year-old American boy," interrupts Mrs. Kang. "He cannot understand old ways." "But Grandma, it's not fair." "Sam," Mrs. Kang turns to her grandson. "Sam, this is not something you can understand." Mr. Kang shakes his head. He brushes away Mrs. Kang's hands. He brushes away the hands of his friends. Suddenly, Sam is frightened. What if Grandma is right? What if Grandpa is sorry after the Hua Mei flies away? What if the Hua Mei gets lost? What if he starves? What if he dies? "Grandpa, wait," says Sam. But Grandpa does not hear. Mr. Kang cannot hear any voice except the voice inside his own head, inside his own heart. He opens the bamboo door. Mr. Kang's Hua Mei perches on the threshold of his cage. Perhaps he thinks it's cage cleaning time. He slowly steps out. He stops to sing a long, sweet note, turns his head to the breeze, and flies into the sky. Mr. Kang takes off his cap and covers his heart with his hand. For a moment there is silence. Mrs. Kang bends her head and hugs herself. Her mouth is in a thin, straight line. "Oh, Mr. Kang," she whispers in Chinese, "what can you be thinking?" Sam starts to cry. "Sam and I are going home to paint poems," said Mr. Kang loudly in English. He lifts his empty bird cage, takes Sam's hand, and together they walk out of the park. Onto the sidewalk, over the corner, across the street, up the block, they walk. Just as they get to Mr. Kang's apartment, there, on the railing, sits the Hua-mei. Mr. Kang and Sam stop short. The bird flies onto Sam's head. Then up the stairs and into the kitchen they run. They sit at the table, coats and caps on. The Hua-mei hops onto Sam's paper. Mr. Kang paints his poem as Sam paints his picture. The bird helps. After 43 American years, I still speak my native language, my native tongue, but any Chinese ear can hear that I no longer speak like a native. Sometimes I even can hear the familiar sounds bending by themselves in my own throat, coming out strangely, sounding a little American. Yet those same words in English suffer more. I open up my American mouth, and no one needs to see my face to know my ship was never Mayflower. But at home, even with you, my Hua-mei peeping a little like a sparrow, I sit at my kitchen table, and I paint these words. They sing out with accent. We are Americans by choice. This is your poem, Birdie, says Mr. Kang. And Sam, it's your poem, too. Then Mr. Kang looks at Sam's painting. My grandson is a great artist, he says. He hangs the painting on the kitchen cabinet, and it sits back to admire it. Mrs. Kang walks into the kitchen with her mouth still in that thin, straight line. But there is the bird, and suddenly she is smiling. Today I'll cook for both of you, and for your Hua-mei, she says, and she makes tea and more sweet and fragrant almond cakes, warm from the oven. So I want you, after we've read this story, to connect it to that essential question on the very first page. What does it mean to grant freedom? I want you to think about what character was granted freedom in this story, and what did that mean for that character?